When using PCG with landscapes, there are probably two things that you kind of want to set up with your landscape. One is being roads that automatically deform the landscape as it goes across, and two, set up some water, whether lakes or rivers or things of that nature. And of course, you'll want to make sure that all of that works with PCG, it gets properly cut out where you want, or not cut out, or spawned, or whatever you'd like in those specific areas. I'll be showing you the basics of how to set up landscape splines, read the information with PCG, including the bounds, as well as set up some basic lakes and rivers, as well as figure out, again, the bounds so you can cut things out from your landscapes for whenever you need to only affect those areas or not affect those areas. And I'll explain some of the basics of how to use all this. I'm going to be showing you inside of my PCG biome setup that I showed in the last video. Everything I'm going to show you will be able to be implemented into any setup you'd like, and I'll explain how. I think it'll be quite simple. Let's get started with just landscape splines. Getting the landscape splines, spawning them, how to change their sizes, how to get that information inside of PCG so you can cut things out and adjust things as needed. Get to landscape splines. In the top left for selection mode, change that to landscape or hit Shift 2. And once you're in here, you'll want to go to the manage section and then select splines here. Now this is going to be your default setup here. The first thing I recommend doing is hitting the plus button here, which creates a new edit layer, and it'll give you this pop-up. And you have the option of creating a regular edit layer or an edit layer splines. And since we'll be working with splines, we want to create an edit layer splines. Go ahead and select. And if I open the layers, you'll see there's now a splines here and a regular layer. The regular layer is where our regular landscape lies, and splines will be on top. But now I have this. So what I can do is go anywhere in the world, press Control and left click, and this will get me a point, as you can see, with this icon. Then I can hold Control and click somewhere else, and it'll place another path. I can click Control again, and again, and again. At any point, I can just select one of these points and just move them around, rotate them, and adjust them as I see fit. So that way I get the shape I want. And if I select the last point again, and let's say I want to make a new one, I don't have to hold Control and click because I've now deselected it. But if I reselect the last point here, I can hold Alt and drag out a new one. And you can see it now goes ahead and does it. Now these look pretty bad because of the way it decided to orient these. So I'll just go ahead and rotate these points, select them, and just rotate them around. And you'll see automatically it is carving into the landscape. I'll go ahead and turn off the biome system that I have so it can be easier to see. It is now raising it where it needs to. And if I raise one of these points, it'll automatically raise that area. This one's being cut in. As you can see, it is below the landscape here. So it's cutting in, but it does have a fall off. So we can now control where this is. So that's great, but we don't have too many controls as of yet on this. So let's say I want to make some adjustments. So what you can do now is select one of these points, and then in the detail panel, you will see a lot of controls here. You have the location and rotation of the point. The half width is the width of the road here. So if I change this to 500, you'll see it gets narrower. Same thing with this one here. If I go ahead and select it and change this one to 2000, it'll get wider. And you can see it automatically deforms the rest of the area. The side fall off is how quickly it falls off here. So it's within 1,000 units. If I make this 0, you'll see it is a sheer cliff. So whatever it is pretty much as straight up and down as it gets. But again, it doesn't affect every other one. It's only where this point is. It's around here. And as you can see, as it goes further towards here, it gets nicely smoothed out. So keep in mind that this is per point. You can, of course, select multiple, just holding Shift, and you select multiple. I can set multiple of these to 0, and you can see, just like that, it is now a sheer cliff all the way through. So you can control how it blends. You can even control things as far as the left side versus right side. And there's also a fall off at the end here, which is sort of like what we're doing here. If I bring this back down into the ground, you'll see the end is actually inside of here, but that's because the fall off is 2000. If I make the fall off 0, it'll go sharply all the way to the end. No fall off, no blending. If I make this just a 500 blend, you can see it blends 500 units here. So pretty cool. You have the ability of easily sculpting with landscape splines. Let's say we want to spawn a road. We want to spawn things on the sides of the road. We need to spawn all of this. The way to do it is with PCG, but you might be wondering, why don't we just use the built-in system to spawn the actual path? Because landscape splines have a built-in spline mesh setup. I'll show you. If I go ahead and left click on the actual green area, I can select the actual segments. I can hold Shift and select multiple of these. And then in the details section, you'll see here under landscape spline meshes, we can add a spline mesh. So if I go ahead and hit plus, we'll add a new entry here. And for a spline mesh, I can just select a regular cube, and you'll see we now have a cube going all the way across. But here's the thing. You might notice right away, this is not very smooth. And while we do have a few options here, for example, we can tell it to not scale to the width, so it'll be the size of a regular cube, or we could turn off no z-scaling, so it'll be like for a regular road where it just changes in the width. But you can see here, it doesn't perfectly line up on top of here. It's not great. It is really based on the number of points here, but sometimes you don't really want to add more points into your landscape spline if this is enough for you. That's where you can use PCG to spawn the road yourself and also spawn things inside of it, or wherever you'd like, cut things out, whatever you need, you can do that with. So let me show you how that's done. I'll go ahead and clear up the spline meshes here. So we're back to just having the road, and I'm going to show you in my regular biome system. I'm going to show it here, but you can of course put this wherever you need to sample it, whether to create it, sample it, cut it out, whatever you need, you can put it wherever. But to get that information, all we need to do is right click and search for get spline data. And the spline data is going to come from all world actors by class. And the class that we're going to choose is the landscape, the regular landscape, not the spline actor, not the spline mesh actor, regular landscape. And if I press A on it, you will see I get a ton of points, a ton of information. And you can even see in the path here in 5.6, there's our information. And one thing you'll notice is we have kind of this dense middle area, and it starts to fall off into darker and darker points. So you actually have a little bit of information going out from it. If I go ahead and press D on it, you will see there's our main points are hidden underneath it. And then when we go a little bit further out, it gets darker and darker for the density value. Now it's not perfect. And that's one thing to note here is it is not perfect, unfortunately. It is pretty good. So now we want to do two things. We want to spawn our spline mesh and make it nicer than it was with the system we just saw. And two, we want to get the kind of the point information to cut it out from everywhere else if we so wish to. So let's start with the spawning. It's relatively simple. You could absolutely just drag out and use a spawn spline mesh, and we can set up this one with the same cube, for example. But if you do just this as is, you'll notice that you have some issues. The points have scale information. They have not enough points. Everything is wrong. So this is why we do a few steps before we just spawn in the spline mesh. I'll go ahead and detach this. And then from the get spline data, we'll use a spline sampler. Also, if you're wondering about this UB that you're seeing here, this is because I'm using hierarchical generation in this in general setup. If I go ahead and just deselect things in the bottom left corner, it goes away. If you're not using highgen and partitioning, you won't see that. Don't worry about it. So on the spline sampler, instead of subdivision, we want to go by distance. And let's say every 500 units is where I want to set the distance. And because we know that it falls off, there's a fade, if you recall, at the very end, I can tell it to stop actually right before the end. In our case, I set the fade to 500, so we'll set the end offset to 500. We can even give it a start offset if we'd like, or we'll leave it as is. And I'll make sure to set unbounded to be true. Depending on your configuration, you might not need to check it on. It just depends on if you have the volume, it is covering everything, or if you're just using a spline, or if you're using like a blueprint with a contained PCG graph. Just know unbounded solves all your problems if you have any at this point. So fantastic. We now have points every 500 units. If I press D on here, you can see there's our points every so often, but you can see it is getting extra information here on the sides because, well, that's kind of how it's set up right now. But for us, that's okay. All we need to do is grab ourselves a transform points node and then scale the actual points here. I'm going to turn off uniform scale and unlock these, and I'll set the scale min to 0.02 on X and Y and 0.02 scale max X and Y. I will leave the height as 1. If you're wondering why 0.02, a cube is 100 units in size. It's not 1 unit size. So I'm basically divided by 100, and then I only wanted half of that. So that's why it went from 1 to 0.01, and I only wanted half, which in our case would be increasing the number by 2. So that's why 0.02. And then from here, I can go ahead and use a create spline node. I can leave it all on default. I don't need to touch anything here. And then from there, I can use the spawn spline mesh that we had before and plug that all the way through. And as you'll see right there, there's our full path. And would you look at that? If I go into game mode, you can see how smooth that is. Look at that. Isn't that so much nicer? Look how smooth it is because we've now set it to be every 500. We can absolutely change this spline sampler's distance to, let's say, 2000. And you can see it is now much rougher because it's now every 2000 units is where it creates the bend. So depending on how smooth you want it, you could absolutely just adjust this distance increment and get the result you need. And as you can see, it goes all the way here till the end until it is right up to that blend. Now keep in mind that this end won't be perfectly 500. It depends on the size of your spacing. It will try to cut out 500 units from the end. Maybe that is one point that it cuts out from the end. Maybe it's multiple. So keep in mind, it's not going to be 100% perfectly to 500 units from the end. What I mean is if I set this distance increment to, let's say, 3000, you can see it is now much much further away because the last piece that would have fit here is one 3,000 unit piece, which would have ended here. If I set this back to 500 and turn off and end offset to 0, make it all the way through to the very end, as close as it can. And as you can see, it still doesn't make it all the way through because the last 500 piece does not fit in here. You might want to play around with the values depending on what you want to achieve. But fantastic, we now have this really nice bend here. Here's the thing, if I turn my biome setup back on, you'll see all the trees and everything is still spawning on the road, and I really do not want to. I want this road to be clear of anything. And unfortunately, you cannot just plug in the spawn spline mesh into a difference node and just have it use the spline mesh as is. But because we do have the bounds roughly in the right place, as you recall from sampling this get spline data, the main center area here within 1.0 of the density is kind of the right thing that we want. So what we can do is from this get spline data, I can search for an attribute filter. I'll go ahead and select it. And what I want to check is equal, and the target attribute that we were checking against is the point density. And we're going to use a constant threshold, and we're going to check that is equal to 1. So if I go ahead and add a debug here from the inside filter, you will see that there you go. It is kind of correct. And I do mean kind of. Unfortunately, it is not perfect. As you can see, we have a little bit of a kink here. For some reason, one of these just happens to be very long over here. It is not perfect. And unfortunately, I could not figure out any way to make it perfect. And honestly, it's probably good enough. The two things that I really want to change though, is I want to fill in these gaps, which is going to be in the x-axis because it's moving forward. And I also want to make it taller. So that way, if for some reason I have something below or above this road, I also want to cut it out. So from this inside filter, I'll drag out and search for bounds modifier. The x value, which is the forward, will scale by 2. So we make sure that it overlaps everything fully. And in the height, I'll scale up by 1,000 units for minimum and maximum. And if I debug it, you'll see now we have a nice tall road, which will cut out everything in this area. And how do we cut it out? Well, at this point, you have the information. You can cut it out from wherever you need. In my case, for this biome setup, if you were following along with the last one, I'm going to cut it out pretty much near the beginning. From the get PCG component data, I'll cut it out right at the start before I do my change grid size. All I'm going to do is use a difference node and then plug this bounds modifier into the differences. And on the difference node, I'm also going to change it from density function minimum to binary. And then the output of this is going to go into the change grid size. And now if I take a look, you can see all our trees here, nothing is impacting where the road is. It is all going all the way around until the very end here. And because we have these points, we can absolutely just spawn things on them. I can add, for example, a new spline sampler, change the distance to 2000, and then use a regular static mesh spawner to spawn something on this road. But if I do that, keep in mind that the original points are massive. So to fix that, all we need to do is drag out and search for scale bounds and grab apply scale to bounds. So that way the scale doesn't apply to the scale of the points. It only applies to the bounds, and then plug that in. And now you'll see we have a small little boulder all along the path. Now, if you're wondering how do you get it to actually have things spawn on the sides, well, this setup is using PCGEx, which means you could do something like this where it'll automatically place something on the edges of your path as you see here. And of course, I have a tutorial for it already on the channel. You can see it right here if you haven't already, or it'll be linked in the description below, assuming I don't forget. But that is the basics of how to get a landscape spline, sample it with PCG, use it to cut things out, and spawn something where it is using PCG itself. Now, one thing to note though is spline meshes like this will unfortunately not work with partitioning and hygiene. At the current moment, a spline mesh can load and unload, but it has to all reside within a single chunk of the partition. If it crosses a boundary, it no longer connects perfectly. It'll have gaps, and I can demonstrate what I mean here. If I go ahead and take this change grid size and intersection setup here, and I put it right before this create spline, the transfer points will go into the change grid size, and that is going to go through. You will see now, right there, you now have seams and cuts, and it does load. As you can see, as I fly out and fly in, it does load and unload, but unfortunately it is not very good at places like this where they just connects. So maybe this is fine for what you're doing, and maybe you have it set up in a specific area where this will not happen, but at that point loading and unloading the entire thing doesn't matter either. So unfortunately, spline meshes do not work with this. And if you're wondering why I don't just connect the create spline first into the change grid size intersection and then spawn spline mesh, in that order, it does not spawn anything. So unfortunately, what we got is just this. So that's just something for you guys to know, so you're ready for it in case you're planning to create a single road system across across the entire landscape everywhere. But with landscape splines covered, let's go ahead to the next thing, which is water. Unreal has a built-in plugin for water. Works pretty well, not only with landscapes, but PCG. It has the information you can read and get the points from. We will need to enable the plugin first. So go to Edit Plugins and search water. You'll see there's this water experimental plugin. You can go ahead and turn it on and hit yes. And you should also turn on the procedural conjuration framework water interrupt, which will allow PCG to work with water. So go ahead and turn that on as well. Yes, and restart the engine. Now, the first time you do this, you will get this pop-up. Do not close it right away. It'll give you this error. Collision profile settings do not include an entry for water body collision profile, which is required for water collision to function. And thankfully, it gives you a simple button. You just click on it and it fixes the problem for you. Just go ahead and click the button and close out of here and close out of your plugin window. But make sure to just press the button and everything's good. Now we can already add some water things in here. So if I go ahead and click this button to add things, I can search water and you'll see now we have some water things. Water zones, body, river, ocean, lake, island, etc. I'll demonstrate with a lake and a river for our situation. So let's go ahead and select water body lake. And you'll see here, insert new landscape edit layer. And you can drag and drop the water layer in the list to choose where in the edit layer stack it should be inserted. At the top is just fine. So I'll go ahead and hit complete. And then it'll go ahead and create the water. And in my case, it's very high in the air. And so it brings the entire thing upwards. You can see here we have an enclosed spline. And we can go ahead and just drag that all the way down. And it'll go ahead and put the lake inside. You can see it has a nice little fall off here. And I can go ahead and take these points, drag them around with holding Alt to create new ones, and make the shape of the lake that I wish. Let's say something like this, for example. You can see it is pushing the landscape up, pulling it down, depending on where it is. And just like the previous one, for the landscape spline, we can control this by selecting the water body lake, the main section here. We can scroll down and you'll see the section for terrain. You have the curve settings, and this elevation curve asset is how it dips down below this curve right here. This is what this is. So if I change this curve to something a little more sharp, you can see it is now much sharper here compared to where it was before. I can put it back to the nice gradual one. So we have control over that. We of course control over the depth of the channel. So right now it goes down 500 units. I can make it go down 2000 and you'll see it is now considerably lower. One thing to note though is the waves are also considerably bigger. If I change this to 500, you can see the waves are a bit smaller. If I set this to 5000, the waves are again bigger. But this is default functionality of water. You can adjust the settings. I'm not going to go into how to make the water pretty. I'm here to show you how to set it up and make it all work and read with PCG. I'll leave it at 500 for now for what we're doing. And we can control the curve ramp width. If I set this to 0, you can see it is again sharp. If I set this back to 2000, it is 2000 units until it gets to the bottom area. So if we want it to be even more blended, we can make this 5000 units. It is far smoother of a transition until it gets to the very center. So it depends on what you want to make. Is it a deep lake, shallow lake? You have a lot of control here. Moving on from the settings though are the water height map settings. We have the fall off settings. So this is the fall off right here. The edge offset is 500. So from the lake, it moves 500 units over and then does the offset. So if I change this 500 edge offset to 0, you can see the transition happens right at the edge of the lake. There is no extra little distance here. And we can change the fall off here by distance. Let's say if I make this 10 degrees, it will transition on a 10-degree angle until it reaches a connection point where it was originally. Let me make this 5, right? It is much smoother of a transition. I can also, instead of angle, change by width. So in this case, it'll take 1024 units before it reconnects to where it was supposed to be. If I make this 2048, it is going further and further. So depending on your setup, you might want to actually have this be a smoother or more sharp transition. And the last setting here that I'll show is the Z offset, which just moves everything around it. So maybe you want the lake kind of here, but you want the area around it to first go up and then down. That is what the Z offset is. So you can make a nice little crater here if you so wish. We'll go ahead and set it to 0 by default though. So that's the settings of the lake. And let's go ahead and add ourselves a river as well. Go ahead, go to add, search water, and I'll add a water body river. Because I'm in the sky, it goes ahead and adds it here. One thing I want to show you is if I take this entire thing and I move it over here, over the road, you can see it is replacing the road here with the river. It is on top of this. If I go back to the landscape and then either under sculpt, you'll see the layers, or back under manage, you still see the layers. You see water's on top of splines. If I move water below splines, you will see it will try to do some weird stuff where it's trying to put the spline where it is. That is the highest thing. So it's trying to override the water with the spline. In this case, the water is way too high for this to actually be realistic. So what I can do to show this a little bit better is if I bring this down much further, here at the end, I can have the water overlap the road. As you can see, the road finishes inside here and the water is just a bit up. Or if I move the splines above the water, you can see the spline is doing the cutout after the water has been placed, which is making the water float. So depending on your setup and depending on how you want these to interact, if they're even ever going to touch, you just put one layer above the other. It's just a matter of what do you want to happen first, then second. In our case, I'll keep water on top. That is fine for me. This seems like the more logical thing for what I'm doing. But now we have this spline. So we can go ahead and just select the point here, hold Alt, drag it out, and make a new one. And you can see we can just connect it all the way through to the actual lake. And let's maybe drop it down and I'll have it reconnect right over here. And you can see at the very end, it automatically is working with the lake to kind of spread out. So this is cool. We can control this water as we did the other one. We can have it go down. We can have it go up. For every point you select, the actual location of this point, keep in mind, is not in the transform. That is the full actor's location. It is down here in the selected points. So if I put this at minus 500, it'll go 500 units down, which is around where the floor is in here. Now, how do you control the size of this actual spline if I want to start wider, narrower, deeper, etc.? Unfortunately, it is not as straightforward on this one because you can't just take this and scale it. If you scale it, it'll change the path, but it will not actually change the depth of this actual area. But you can absolutely scale it in X, as you see, to change the curvature, or you can just click on the tangents and move them, whatever is easier. With the point selected, because it is per point again, right below selected points, there's this water section. Go ahead and open it, and that's where the settings are. There's your depth. So here I can, for example, say it is 500 deep, and maybe set it to be 500 deep where it connects. And you can see here, now underwater, it goes from a much shallower area to a deeper one until it connects all the way through. And you can see it gets cut out, but it doesn't get cut out as much, so I can just drag this a little bit further in, and now it gets cut out a little bit better, as you can see. So we can control per point the depth, the river width. You can see here, we can make this wider, 4096. We can make the original point here a little bit shorter, say 512. You can also change the velocity of this water, and if you have audio, there's an audio intensity control. So cool, we have this in here now. If I re-enable the PCG Biome System, it of course is not cutting anything out. Not only that, but if I go ahead and regenerate the points on all the splines I have, well, now things are real bad. They're now just underwater, which maybe is you want, but in our case, I want to make sure that nothing is spawning in the lake. This needs to be a nice area where nothing spawns. So let's go ahead and get this information. For the difference on this one, I am going to, instead of doing it on the main graph, I'm going to do it in the biome spline. Again, where you do the difference entirely depends on your setup. All it is taking the points and removing anything unnecessary. So if you want to put it earlier or later, depending on what you're doing, feel free to. This is my spline biome setup. I'm going to do it right before this output here. Now, how do we actually get the information that we need? Well, let's start with the lake first. If I go ahead and right click, I can search for water, and this will get us the get water spline data. Now, you might be looking at this in the detail panel, like it looks oddly familiar, because if I do right click get spline data, you'll notice that nothing has changed here in the detail panel, but here I am just selecting two different nodes. So what's the difference? Well, the water spline data is from the interop that we enabled. If I go ahead and set both of these up, I'm going to change them to be from self to all world actors. Instead of by tag, it'll be by class, and the class is going to be water, and you'll have a few of them, and you'll see here water body lake. Let's go ahead and select it. We'll even enable select multiple in case we have multiple in the world, and we'll do the same thing on this get spline data so I can show you the difference. All world actors by class, water body lake, select multiple. If I on the original spline data press A, you'll see here's the point information that we have from that spline. It has all the regular information all the way up to the interpretation type, tangents. But if we do it on the get water spline data and press A here, and then scroll more to the right, you will see we have depth, water velocity, river width, and audio intensity. For the lake, this doesn't matter from what I can see. The reason I say that is because for our lake, you can see here channel depth is what we're actually using. We don't use the water river stuff. We're using the channel depth, which is different. So unfortunately, you're not going to get the proper information from the lake itself. But for the river, if I duplicated this and changed the actor selection class to water body river, and here on the water spline data water body river, you can see we have depth, water velocity scalar, river width, and audio intensity like before. And here's the thing you might be noticing. Depth, again, that's not the correct depth. If you recall, if I select the point here, our river width is 2048, but our depth is 500. And if I go all the way to the beginning here, our depth is 150. And if I change this depth to 600, this is not updating correctly. And I can force regen, it will still not get the information correctly. So genuinely, Genuinely, I don't know why, but it's still helpful to use, because despite not having the information from these in terms of the visual information, it still somehow has it. I don't know why, I don't know how, but let me show you. We'll start with the spline data for the water body lake. For that one, I'm just going to use a spline sampler. I'll change it to be on interior and I'll make it unbounded. I'll keep it at 100 spacing. You can adjust these values for how you see fit. And then if I go ahead and press D to debug it, you will see that there's our points, every 100 points across, but you can see it's down here. It is not really where the water is. So that's another problem. We might have things spawning all the way at the bottom, maybe a little bit above. We gotta fix this. So easy solution, bounds modifier. Scale the Z-axis by 10. You can of course scale it by more or less depending on the depth of your setup. You can see here we're going all the way above and we're pretty much going right up to the bottom. And if I ever want to make this a deeper area, maybe it would be good to do 30. And now it's gonna go a bit deeper all the way through. So now I can go ahead and take this and add ourselves a difference node right before this output or right before you're spawning whatever it is you need. That goes all the way to the end. The bounds modifier goes to the differences and the difference node itself gets changed to binary. And now you can see everything from the lake is gone. I can zoom out, zoom in, and things from the lake are now being properly cut out. Now it's not affecting the river yet. In the river, we still have things spawning. The lake is now taken care of. Now for the river. For that, it'll be another spline sampler. But in this one, instead of subdivision, I will choose distance. And maybe the distance increment can be here like 300. I think that'll be smooth enough. And I'll make sure it's also checked to unbounded. You might not need this as I mentioned before. In my setup, it helps. So at this point, I want to show you a little difference. I'm going to use a regular get spline data here. Again, I'll recreate the class of water river here, like we did before in the example, water body river. And I'll use the same spline sampler. And I'll show you. If I sample the regular spline and press D on the spline sampler, this is our actual spline here. You can see it gets thinner, it gets thicker. It's not actually correct because it shouldn't be thinner here. It shouldn't be thicker here because it's actually the opposite. But if I go ahead and debug the water spline data one, well, that looks a little bit different, doesn't it? And this is the odd thing. It clearly has the information that is a little bit different than what we were using before. So that's interesting. So we're going to use this one because this one's a little bit easier, even though it seems like it's going out too far. From the spline sampler off of the water spline data, all we do is modify the bounds. So we'll use a bounds modifier. And I want to scale the y-axis, which is the width, by half. And now if we take a look at it, well, that looks more correct for what we expect. You see how it's the correct size here? It goes out and again connects in the correct way. So this is now making a lot more sense. Now, it is still only the thickness that it is here, which is still not correct. Now, there is this depth value, and we can try using it. We try using it by using a set attribute, plugging in the bounds modifier into in A and in B. For in A, we'll set it to be point extents. We want to specify extents.z. So extents.z is the height of the object, or rather half of it. And I want to replace it with depth. And if I press D on this, where we've now replaced extents.z with depth, we can go down under here and take a look. And would you look at that? Lines up. This part is thicker. This is thinner. This is thicker. Hold on a second. Well, this doesn't make any sense because if I press A on this point and I scroll to the right here, the depth is, there's information here. Look at this depth information. But over here on the spline data, we had nothing. It all said 150. I can only laugh at that because I don't know why, but after you do a spline sampler, you can see there's the depth information of everything. There's the river width at every single point of it. You even still have the audio intensity, and if you had the water velocity scaler, I'm sure that would be updating too. And in the lake, unfortunately, it's still all the same. So if you're wondering, oh, did that mean the lake also gets updated? No, the lake is just the lake. I don't know why. We absolutely can use that information for the river, which means we now have the perfect bounds for it. But, and this is a big but, this is getting the information of the river as is, in its pure clean form. What I mean is, if you select the river, then scroll down to effects, open that up, and go to curl noise. And if I add some curl amount, let's say 0.35, 0.35, and I make it this wobbly river using a little bit of noise, this will not change. The cutout of this will be the original shape. It will not actually take in consideration this new kind of wobbly path that it is. And let me tell you, I tried a lot of things to hopefully get around this. I even tried using world rayhit queries, raycasts. Unfortunately, in these areas, for whatever reason, it will still hit the river, even though the landscape is there. And unfortunately, my brain was not smart enough to figure out a way of figuring out where to cut things out for one versus another. So just so you know, it may be possible. At the current moment, I haven't figured it out how. Assuming you're okay with that, or maybe you don't actually wobble it that much, maybe just a little bit, this cutout out will be just fine. And by the way, if you want to remove these little gaps, just like I did before for the bounds modifier, just scale it in by 2 for min and max. You don't need to go as far as 2, but you can see then it is nice solid, so there's no single gap in between. And once you have that, that just gets plugged right into the differences. And just like that, we have no more trees spawning on this river. Nothing is spawning, nothing below, everything gets cut out, and we have all this information. And keep in mind, we have the point here. We can just spawn things now from these points if we want to. I use them to get the bounds to cut things out, but I also technically have the information of the river. I can just spawn things in the river now, or spawn things in the lake. If I want to spawn things at the bottom of the lake, I have the points of the lake. I can project them down onto the landscape, and I know that those will be at the bottom of the lake area. Lots of things you can do here, but the main thing is it now all works with PCG, and you have a lot of control now. Now, aside from the actual paths here and the lake and the river, there's another way of modifying the actual terrain with PCG, and that's using landscape patches. And I have a video on that as well, which I will make sure to link below, or you can check out in the card here. I also want to give big thank you to the Patreons that support me. You guys are awesome. Thank you so much. If you'd like to join their community, the link to the Discord will be down below as always. And if you missed the start of this environment, how it's being created with PCG and biomes and everything together, check out this video right over here. Get yourself started on something big.